3 weeks before Thanksgiving, my parents told me not to come home. Not because I'd done something catastrophically wrong. Not because I'd committed some unforgivable sin that warranted exile from the family table. But because, in their words, it wouldn't look right if you were there. Those 9 words would become the catalyst for everything that followed, a moment so loaded with rejection and shame that I remember standing in my small apartment in Portland, holding my phone against my ear, feeling the oxygen drain from the room. My mother's voice was calm, almost clinical, the way she gets when she's making decisions that require no emotion. My father was somewhere in the background. I could hear him breathing, could picture him sitting in his leather recliner in the living room of the house I grew up in, the one with the wraparound porch and the oak trees, the house that was supposed to always be home. But home, I was learning, came with conditions. Home required you to fit neatly into the family narrative. Home required you to be useful, compliant, and most importantly, invisible when it served everyone else's interests. What my parents didn't know, what they had absolutely no idea about, was that I secretly controlled my brother's $15 million inheritance. Not metaphorically, not loosely, literally. And the moment they discovered this truth, everything they had built, every lie they had told themselves, every manipulation they had constructed to maintain their carefully curated image, would come crashing down with the kind of finality that even time couldn't heal. This isn't just a story about money. It's about power. It's about what happens when love becomes transactional, when family becomes a business arrangement, and when one person finally decides they're done playing by rules designed to keep them small. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. My name is Olivia Catherine Hartwell, though everyone in my family calls me Liv, and this is the story of how I became the most powerful person in my family by accident, and then by design. To understand how we got here, I need to take you back to 1998. I was 8 years old. My brother Marcus was 5. We lived in a suburban neighborhood outside of Cleveland, Ohio, the kind of place where everyone's house looked like everyone else's house, where the grass had to be the right shade of green, where the children had to be the right shade of successful, and where my mother's coffee club friends were the arbiters of what constituted a well-lived life. My parents, Richard and Catherine Hartwell, were what you might call upper-middle-class drivers. They weren't old money. They weren't genuinely wealthy. But they had convinced everyone, including themselves, that they were important. My father was a financial advisor with a moderate practice. My mother was a homemaker who treated that role like it was a corporate position requiring weekly performance reviews and quarterly improvements. They both came from working-class families, and this meant that everything they did was in service of proving to their parents, their peers, and the universe that they had transcended their origins. They were terrified of falling back. Terrified of being ordinary. Terrified of anyone discovering that they were, in fact, just like everyone else. The way this terror manifested in our household was through an invisible hierarchy that seemed to shift depending on utility. When Marcus was born, something changed in my mother's eyes. I was old enough to notice it, even as an 8-year-old. It was subtle, but it was there, a shift in focus, like he had suddenly become the repository of all of her hopes and ambitions, while I became the problem that needed managing. I wasn't rebellious. I wasn't difficult. I was, in fact, a remarkably compliant child. I got good grades. I didn't talk back. I cleaned my room. But I was also independent. I asked questions. I preferred books to socializing. I didn't seem impressed by my mother's social status the way Marcus naturally was. I didn't need constant reassurance that I was doing things right. And this, somehow, made me suspect. My parents started calling me the serious one, in tones that suggested seriousness was a character flaw. They called Marcus charming and bright and destined for great things, and I could feel the space between us growing wider every year. By the time I was 12 and Marcus was 9, it was already clear which child was expected to be the future, and which was expected to facilitate it. Marcus was groomed in the way wealthy families groom their heirs. He was enrolled in the best schools, sent to the most exclusive camps, introduced to the right families. He was told constantly that he was exceptional. He was given opportunities and presented with the world as a place that would naturally bend toward his ambitions. Meanwhile, I was told to be practical and realistic and to focus on being supportive. The word supportive haunted me. It meant whatever it needed to mean to serve someone else's agenda. It meant erasing parts of myself that weren't convenient for the family brand. It meant learning early and without being taught explicitly that my value was entirely dependent on how useful I could be to people I loved. The interesting thing about being made invisible in a family is that you become very good at seeing. While my parents were focused on Marcus's trajectory, I was developing skills they didn't even know I was developing. I became obsessed with understanding how money worked. Not because I wanted to be rich, though I understood even as a teenager that money was the language my family spoke, the only language they truly understood. I became obsessed because I wanted to understand power. I wanted to understand how my father could sit across from people in his financial practice and make decisions about their lives. I wanted to understand how my mother could lord her country club membership over people like it was an achievement equivalent to curing cancer. I wanted to understand the mechanism of superiority. So, I read books. I took every finance class offered at my high school. I got a summer job at a local bank when I was 16. While my mother was frustrated that I wasn't spending the summer at an exclusive tennis camp, I was learning about portfolio management, trust structures, and tax implications. By the time I was 18, I could read a financial statement the way other people read gossip magazines. My brother, meanwhile, was perfect in all the ways that counted in our family. He was handsome in that casual way that genetics gifts to some people without them having to work for it. He was charming. He was good at sports without being obsessive about them. He dated girls that my mother approved of. He seemed to move through the world with a confidence that my parents had installed in him like a software update. And here's the thing I want to be crystal clear about, because this is important to the story. Marcus wasn't a bad person. He wasn't villainous. He was just a product of a system that had convinced him he was more important than he was, more capable than he actually was, and more deserving than he ever could be. He was a victim of being told he was destined for greatness before he had any idea what he was actually good at. When Marcus was 18 and I was 21, something happened that would fundamentally reshape our family dynamics and ultimately put me in a position of extraordinary power that nobody, least of all me, had anticipated. Our maternal grandfather, Charles Westbrook, died. Grandpa Charlie had always been my favorite family member because he was the only person who seemed to see me. He would ask me about my reading. He wanted to know what I was thinking about. He never made me feel like I had to perform or justify my existence. Unlike my parents, who seemed to experience my independence as a personal insult, Grandpa Charlie treated it like a feature, not a bug. His will was extraordinary, in ways that became clear only in retrospect. He had accumulated significant wealth over his lifetime, not through flashy success but through the quiet, consistent approach of someone who understood that money was a tool and that the best tools were the ones nobody watched you using. His estate totaled approximately $20 million. Of that $20 million, $15 million was placed into a trust for my brother. The remaining $5 million was distributed to my mother and her siblings. But here's where things got interesting in ways that would define the next 2 decades of my life. The trust for Marcus wasn't given to my parents to control, which is what my mother had clearly anticipated and, based on her reaction, desperately wanted. Instead, Grandpa Charlie had named a trustee. He had named me. I was 21 years old, a junior in college, and suddenly I had complete legal authority over my 15-year-old brother's inheritance. The will read, I leave the sum of $15 million in trust to my grandson Marcus James Hartwell, to be held and managed by my granddaughter Olivia Catherine Hartwell in her capacity as sole trustee. Olivia is to distribute funds for Marcus's education, health, and reasonable living expenses as she deems appropriate and in Marcus's best interest. Upon Marcus reaching the age of 35, or upon his marriage, or upon his demonstrated need for financial independence, The trustee shall transfer full control of the remaining principal and all accumulated gains to Marcus, provided he has demonstrated sufficient maturity and financial responsibility. Should Olivia become unable or unwilling to serve as trustee, a corporate trustee shall take her place. This decision is intentional and reflects my complete confidence in Olivia's judgment, integrity, and love for her brother. I remember reading those words and feeling like the floor had shifted beneath me. It wasn't that I didn't understand what they meant. It was that I understood exactly what they meant, and the weight of that understanding was crushing. My mother, when she read the will, went white. I watched her face, and I could see her mind working, recalculating, revising her understanding of the world in real time. She had expected to control that money. She had expected to use it to solidify her social position, to underwrite her lifestyle, to have authority over my brother that was anchored in financial control. Instead, Grandpa Charlie, in an act of breathtaking clarity, had given that control to me. The person she had systematically made invisible. The person she had treated as merely supportive. The person she had convinced wasn't valuable enough to warrant real attention. She looked at me, and I will never forget the expression on her face. It wasn't love. It wasn't even respect. It was recognition. She was recognizing, for the first time, that I had power and that she had no ability to take it from me. My father's reaction was different. He was angry, but his anger was directed at Grandpa Charlie, not at me, which was actually worse in some ways. He argued that the will was unusual, that it made no sense, that a corporate trustee should have been the default. He suggested, in my presence, which was stunning, that perhaps Grandpa Charlie had had cognitive decline in his final years, that perhaps the will wasn't actually valid. But it was valid. The lawyer was clear on that point. Grandpa Charlie had been lucid, sharp, and entirely intentional in his decision. And that intentionality had to mean something. I've spent 20 years thinking about why Grandpa Charlie did this. I've considered whether he was punishing my parents, rewarding me, protecting Marcus, or just making a choice that was optimized for honesty rather than for comfort. I think it was probably some combination of all of those things. I think Grandpa Charlie saw how my family operated. He saw that I was being systematically undervalued. He saw that my parents were using money as a tool of control. He saw that Marcus was being set up for a kind of destruction that only comes from being told you're exceptional before you know what you're actually good at. And he created a system that would force all of us to tell the truth. But that truth took time to emerge.
For years, I simply did my job.
I finished college. I got a degree in finance. I went to work for a wealth management firm in New York. And I quietly, carefully, methodically managed my brother's trust. I distributed money for his education. I distributed money for his living expenses. I coordinated with the financial advisors I had hired to manage the principal so that it continued to grow. I did everything exactly right. I did everything exactly as Grandpa Charlie intended. And the longer I did it, the more invisible I became in my family's narrative. My parents adjusted to the reality of my control by simply pretending it didn't exist. They stopped asking me questions about how the trust was managed. They didn't want to know how the money worked or what decisions I was making. They wanted to maintain the fantasy that the money was simply there, available, that my brother would eventually have access to it, and that their concern for his welfare was their primary motivation. They even stopped being angry at me, which was somehow worse than if they had fought me openly. Instead, they developed a kind of resentment that was so cold it made the air around them feel thin. They would make comments in social situations about how grateful they were that Marcus had been so fortunate, how fortunate he was to have a trustee who was managing things responsibly. The way they said it made it clear that they understood I was managing things responsibly, which meant I was handling their money, which meant they couldn't have it. And that was fundamentally the wrong outcome from their perspective. During this period, my relationship with Marcus evolved. He was in college when the trust was established, and like many young men in his situation, he didn't think much about money. He knew he had access to resources. He knew that when he needed something, it was usually available. He assumed that his privileged life was simply the natural state of the world. It didn't occur to him to ask questions about the mechanics of it. But as he got older, as he graduated and entered the world, as he started having experiences that contradicted the narrative he had been given about his own specialness, he began to realize that something was more complicated than he had understood. He would call me and ask me to explain things. Why did I need to approve certain expenditures? Why couldn't he just access the money directly? Why did I make certain investment choices? And I would explain it all to him, slowly, carefully, in the same way Grandpa Charlie must have thought about explaining it. I told him that the trust was designed to protect him, to ensure that his money grew rather than being depleted through poor decisions, to give him time to mature before he had complete control of a life-changing amount of money. And Marcus, to his credit, listened. He didn't fight me. He didn't resent me. Over time, he actually seemed to respect my decisions. We developed a relationship that was, surprisingly, built on trust. He trusted that I was acting in his best interest, and I was. It was the cleanest, most honest relationship in my entire family. By the time Marcus was 30, my parents had settled into a particular kind of equilibrium. They had a nice life, funded partially by my father's financial practice and partially by Grandpa Charlie's $5 million inheritance, which they had invested wisely. They maintained their country club membership. They traveled. They had the appearance of success. But they also had the constant, low-level frustration that comes from knowing someone else controlled something they desperately wanted to control. They never said it explicitly, but the feeling was there, underneath every conversation, underneath every family gathering. And then, in September of the year that Marcus turned 31, my mother did something that I'd been dreading and half expecting for years. She called me with a proposal. She said she wanted to restructure the trust arrangement. She said that Marcus was mature now, that he should have more control over his own money, and that perhaps it would be better if a neutral third party, which is to say, she and my father, had more involvement in the decision-making process. She was very careful with her language. She didn't say she wanted to take over. She said she wanted to support me in managing the trust. She said she wanted to make sure that Marcus was getting the most out of his inheritance. What she was actually saying was, give us control, or we will make your life as difficult as possible. It was the moment I had been waiting for. It was the moment when I had to decide whether I was going to remain the invisible facilitator of my family's narrative, or whether I was going to stop pretending that their desires for control were legitimate. I told her no. I said, very clearly and very calmly, that the trust was structured as Grandpa Charlie intended it, that I had fulfilled that responsibility with integrity, and that I would continue to do so. I said that if she had concerns about my management, she was welcome to speak with the trust attorney. I said that I believed Grandpa Charlie had made his decision for good reasons, and that I respected it. The silence on the other end of the phone was complete. My mother had never, in my entire life, been told no by me in a way that mattered. I had been compliant my entire life. I had been supportive. I had been understanding. And, in that moment, I was finally not. She recovered quickly. She said that she was disappointed that I was being difficult. She said that she and my father had expected more maturity from me. She said that they wanted to have a family discussion about it, and that my refusal to engage in such a discussion was selfish. But I had stopped listening to her framing. I had spent 20 years listening to her frame things, and I was done. I told her that there was nothing to discuss, that I would continue managing the trust as I had been, and that I hoped she could accept that. Then I hung up the phone. I didn't hear from my parents for 2 weeks. And then, on a Tuesday in late September, my mother called. Her voice was different.
It was smaller somehow.
Colder. She said that they had made a decision about Thanksgiving. She said that they had discussed it with family friends and that they believed it would be better for everyone if I didn't attend that year. She said that I was welcome to celebrate with other family members, but that my presence at their table wouldn't look right. She said it very calmly, as if she was reading from a script she had rehearsed. She said it as if this was a reasonable, rational decision that any reasonable, rational person would understand and accept. And I think what made it most painful was that she wasn't angry. She was disappointed, which somehow hurt more. I hung up the phone and cried, which I hadn't expected to do. I had prepared myself for anger. I had prepared myself for threats. I had prepared myself for her to use money as a weapon or to try to find some way to leverage what little control she had left. But I hadn't prepared myself for this. The moment when she simply decided I wasn't worth including. The moment when she finally gave me what I probably should have asked for years ago, permission to not be part of a family that saw me as an asset to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I didn't have to decide what to do about Thanksgiving, because something else happened first. Marcus called me 3 days after my mother's call. He sounded strange. He sounded like someone who had just discovered that everything he believed about his world was constructed on a foundation that was less solid than he had thought. He said very carefully that he had been looking at some of his financial documents and that he had questions about how the trust was structured. He said that he had been having conversations with his girlfriend about financial planning and that she had pointed out that he didn't actually have direct control over his own money, which was unusual. He said that his girlfriend had suggested he investigate the terms of the trust more carefully. And so he had. He had read the will. He had spoken with the trust attorney. And he had discovered the full extent of what Grandpa Charlie had done. He had discovered that I was listed as the sole trustee, with complete control. He had discovered that the distributions I had been making to him were legally my decisions, not his rights. He had discovered that I could theoretically refuse him access to his own money if I decided he wasn't acting in his own best interest. And he was calling to ask me what the hell was going on. I remember my hands shaking as I explained the trust to him. I remember the tone in his voice shifting as he began to understand the implications. I remember him saying quietly, "So you've had the power this whole time." I told him yes. I told him that Grandpa Charlie had decided that I should be the trustee, that I had been managing the money in what I believed to be his best interest, and that when he turned 35 or got married or demonstrated sufficient maturity and financial responsibility, the money would be his completely. I told him that I had done everything to be fair and responsible with that power. I told him that I had never used it as leverage or as a tool of control. But I also told him the truth. I told him that his girlfriend was right, that he didn't have control over his own money, and that this was unusual, and that Grandpa Charlie had done this for reasons that probably had something to do with understanding how our family actually worked. There was a long silence on the phone. And then Marcus asked me one question that changed everything. He asked, "Did Mom and Dad know?" I told him the truth. I told him that they had known since the will was read, that they had tried to force me to give them control a few weeks ago, and that when I refused, they had disinvited me from Thanksgiving. The moment I said it, I realized that Marcus had called me before any of this conversation with our parents. He had done his own research. He had discovered the truth on his own. And he was calling me to understand it before he processed it through our parents' narrative. What happened next was the thing that my parents had always feared, the thing that would have happened sooner if not for the particular structure of social control they had put in place. Marcus actually read the will for himself. Completely. And he read the letter that had been attached to it, the letter that Grandpa Charlie had written for him to read when he was old enough to understand it. That letter was extraordinary. In it, Grandpa Charlie explained that he loved Marcus, that he believed in him, but that he was also terrified for him. He explained that he had watched my parents use money to control every aspect of my life, and that he was worried they would do the same to Marcus if they had the chance. He explained that he had named me as trustee because he believed I had the integrity and the independence to refuse to be controlled, and because he believed I would protect Marcus from control rather than wielding it myself. He explained that the true purpose of the trust wasn't to give me power over Marcus. It was to create a situation where no one else could have power over Marcus. It was to ensure that there would be a period of time before Marcus had complete control of his money where that control would rest with someone who loved him and would not use it as leverage. And then, in the final paragraph, Grandpa Charlie wrote something that must have hit Marcus like a physical force. "I am doing this because I love you more than I love comfort. I am doing this because real love means sometimes telling people the truth about themselves, even when they don't want to hear it. And I suspect that you are going to hear many versions of the truth about this decision. But I want you to know, unambiguously, that the person I trust most to protect your interests is your sister. She has always been willing to tell the truth. She has always been willing to do the hard thing. She is the strongest person in your family, even if nobody has told her that yet. Marcus called me back after reading that letter. He was crying. He said, "Grandpa Charlie trusted you more than anyone, and Mom is punishing you for it." And then he said the thing that would determine everything that came next. He said, "I'm calling Mom and Dad, and I'm telling them that if you're not at Thanksgiving, I'm not either." When Marcus told our parents that he wasn't coming to Thanksgiving unless I was invited, something shifted in the power dynamics of our family in a way that probably should have happened years earlier. My mother's response was to tell Marcus that he was being influenced by me, that I had turned him against them, that I was being manipulative and controlling. She said this to my brother while completely ignoring the fact that she had literally just disinvited his sister from a family holiday in an attempt to punish her for not giving them control of his money. My father said nothing, which was the most devastating response of all. His silence indicated that he understood the contradiction, that he recognized the absurdity of accusing me of control while simultaneously trying to control access to my brother's money, and that he had chosen, in that moment, to protect himself through neutrality rather than to protect his marriage or his children. The week before Thanksgiving, there was a family meeting. My parents insisted on it. They wanted to talk things through and resolve the situation. I almost didn't go. I almost decided that I was done, that I had given enough, that I had played enough roles and facilitated enough of their dysfunction. But I went. I drove to Ohio. I sat across from my parents in that living room with the leather recliner and the view of the oak trees, and I waited to hear what they had to say. My mother spoke first. She said that she understood I had decided to be difficult, that I had chosen to put myself at odds with the family, and that while she was disappointed, she was also ready to move forward if I was willing to work with them on the trust situation. What she was saying, in the language my family had always used, was this: if I agreed to give them control, she would forgive me for having had power in the first place. She would forgive me for being the person my grandfather had trusted. She would forgive me for refusing to bend. She would forgive me for being honest. And I would finally be allowed to come home. It was a test, and I had a choice about whether to pass it or to fail it. I looked at my mother, and I said something I have never regretted, something that might have been the most honest thing I have ever said to her. I said, "I forgive you." She looked shocked. She said, "Forgive me for what?" And I said, "For making me feel like my value was dependent on my usefulness. For making me feel like my independence was a betrayal. For disinviting me from Thanksgiving because I wouldn't give you power that was never yours to ask for. For all of it." There was a very long silence. My father stared at his shoes. My mother's face did something complicated, a series of micro-expressions that suggested she was processing something that her mind didn't have a template for. And then she said quietly, "Thanksgiving is canceled. Marcus has decided to spend it with your father's sister instead. So it doesn't matter." But it did matter. It mattered because she had said it out loud. She had admitted, finally, that the issue wasn't about me being difficult or selfish or manipulative. The issue was that she couldn't control the situation, and that made her feel powerless, and the feeling of powerlessness was so threatening that she was willing to destroy her family to avoid it. What happened after that moment has been years of slow, careful reconstruction. Marcus did eventually take full control of his inheritance. He did this not because I released it to him, but because he turned 35 and the trust, as structured, required me to transfer the funds to him. When I asked him if he wanted to take control at 30, as he was legally allowed to do, he said no. He said he trusted my management and that he wanted to wait. And when he finally did take control at 35, he did so with the kind of maturity and wisdom that comes from understanding that money is just a tool, that inheritance is a responsibility, and that the people who love you are the ones who will be honest with you even when it costs them something. My parents attempted, over the years, to repair the relationship with me. They suggested family therapy. They suggested that I was being unforgiving. They suggested that I was prioritizing my resentment over family unity. But I had realized something that took me 20 years to understand. Family unity that requires me to deny reality is not unity. It is complicity. It is asking me to lie about what I experienced so that someone else can feel better about how they treated me. And I was finally done with that bargain. I see my parents now on holidays when I choose to. I have set boundaries that would have seemed impossible to my 21-year-old self. I have created a relationship with them that is warm but distant, that is cordial but honest. And the most interesting thing about this arrangement is that they seem to prefer it to the alternative. They prefer a daughter who is present but bounded to a daughter who is absent because the alternative to presence was obliteration. Marcus and I have become closer as a result of all of this. Our relationship is no longer mediated by our parents' needs or our parents' anxiety. We talk about what happened. We talk about what Grandpa Charlie understood about our family. We talk about what he was trying to protect us from and what he was trying to teach us. And sometimes, Marcus tells me that he thinks Grandpa Charlie was trying to teach me something, too. He was trying to teach me that my power was legitimate, that my independence wasn't a betrayal, that the ability to refuse to bend was not a character flaw, but a character strength. He was trying to create a situation where I would have to own my power, where I would have to refuse to be controlled, where I would have to finally understand that the most loving thing I could do was sometimes to say no. And that's what I did. I said no to my parents' attempt to control me. I said no to their reframing of that control as love. I said no to the implicit bargain that had defined my entire childhood, that if I was just useful enough, just compliant enough, just invisible enough, I would finally be loved. I said no. And it took losing my family's approval to gain my own. That's the story of how I became the most powerful person in my family by accident, and then by design. And if you're still listening, if you made it this far, I want you to know something. Wherever you are, whoever told you that your value is dependent on your usefulness, that your love is conditional on your compliance, that your independence is a betrayal, that person was wrong. Your power is legitimate. Your boundaries are real. Your right to say no is sacred. And the relationships worth keeping are the ones where you don't have to diminish yourself to be loved. Thank you for listening to another story from Olive Revenge Stories. Please subscribe, and let's keep breathing life into the stories that were never meant to stay silent.